Last year I was really lucky. A friend at work said, I have a sourdough starter and it's fabulous. Now I've tried for about a year to make sourdough and every single time it fell flat. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't really know what I was doing, and therein was the problem. Now recently I have noticed that every second friend seems to be making sourdough. I think it has something to do with the current crisis that's happening and people not wanting to go into supermarkets, or there not being enough bakery items in supermarkets. So sourdough is the new trend. It is the new thing of the 2020s, which in a way is a good thing that's come from some very bad. But I thought it would be good to have a session to talk about how I make sourdough. And then after this, feel free to message me. You can hear my kids giggling in the back. They're having too much fun. And I'll do my best to answer them. And a lot of things for me are trial by error, and I'm still learning, so it's less than perfect. Now, this is one I've made before. I was hoping to have this coming straight out of the oven as we were doing this, or just before, and that hasn't quite worked out with our evening this evening, but that's fine too. Now normally I would have this rise a little bit more as well, so normally I'd have it a bit bigger, but that's going to be okay too. Now it's really important to slash it. Now I tend to cut in too much, but if you actually want to sort of slash it, you can see my husband looking at me going, because this is usually his job and he does a much better job. Now the reason you do this is because as the bread cooks, it expands quite a lot. Yep, thank you honey. Thank you, Neil. It expands quite a lot, and if you don't do it, it'll sort of break around the bottom. Now, it might do that anyway, and one of the beautiful things about sourdough bread is how rustic it is. So it doesn't matter if it's not perfect. Really, it doesn't. It's a gift that's made with love, and each loaf of sourdough is unique, and so don't stress. I'm now going to put it in the oven. We've put on the oven to virtually as hot as it can get. It's currently on about 220. Sourdough bread loves a super hot oven. So don't treat it like a cake. It's a completely different thing. And the other thing is that it's also got a steam bath in it. So on the lower shelf, I've got a whole tray, or Neil's put in a whole tray full of boiling water. So let's put it in the oven now. And with any luck, we'll have some fresh bread at the end of this. So there it's there, and that, like I said, there was a tray of boiling water. So we just put it in any kind of baking tray. It's on a nice hot temperature. And we leave it go. So, now the absolute key to a good sourdough bread is the starter. Without a good starter, you're not doing anything. Now, one of the issues that I had for a long time was that I killed my starters. So I was given a starter by some friends and I didn't really know how to feed and care for it. And so I killed it. Now, that seems kind of terrible, really, but, I think it's okay. I don't think anyone actually died in that process. But I just want you to have a look at what it looks like and see how it gets all gunky on the side. Don't worry about that. You can always wash that jar off. You can put it in a new jar. You can do things. And you only really need about that much to start with. So if someone gives you a starter, we'll do that first. If someone gives you a starter, and then we'll talk about how to make a starter. But you can see, oh, I've got it in my nose. You can see there that when you kind of swirl around, you can see it's got bubbles. So I know it's alive and it smells right. Like after a while, you get to know how it smells. You don't always get that sense at first when you're first doing it, but you do after a while. So basically, I'm going to aim to put about double this quantity that's here in flour and water in equal parts. Now, normally I would kind of measure that out, but I haven't today, but I'm going to wing it and it's going to be fine. I mix it up, and once again, you can see when I mix it up, it goes all bubbly. So I know it's alive. It looks a bit like, that glue you used to make, or I used to make when I was a kid, that they would use for craft projects when you're in preschool, so it wasn't toxic. And it is literally just flour and water. It's nothing else. The trick though is that this is fermented flour and water. The big advantage to getting a starter from a friend is that the starter will improve and develop flavours over time. It even sort of takes in that natural sort of, what do you call it? That's not a natural yeast really. It's like the, I'll think of the word, but it's not a, I think it's almost like wild yeast actually. I'll stand corrected there. But it takes it in from the air and it develops a really unique flavour. So if you know of someone who's had a sourdough in their family for months, years, even decades, that it's a heritage, that's what you want. But you can make your own and we're going to get to that soon. So to store it, you put some fabric on the top, you put a plastic bag on the top, plastic band over it if you like, or something a bit more fancy, and you leave it in a warm place. At the moment it's early autumn and it's a beautiful weather for sourdough. In our hot summer where Canberra had 3 days that were about 42 degrees and several days that were just, well actually 3 days over 40 and several days that were like 42 degrees, and one day that was 42.6 degrees. It was crazy. In that kind of hot weather, just to keep this going, if I was leaving it out, I was feeding it up to 3 times a day. And I knew I had to do that because it developed an alcohol smell. It basically turned to alcohol. And so it was just a very hungry fermentation process. It needed to be fed regularly. In winter, when it's really cold, you wouldn't need to feed it as often. Ideally, what you should do when it's cold is what we do overnight, which is put it in an esky with a hot water bottle so that it keeps nice and cozy. Or put it in a room where you've got an oil heater nearby. Not too close, you don't want to burn it. You can't have things that are sort of warmer than lukewarm or you will kill it. Like I said, it's a bit like a child. You do need to treat it carefully and with love. But if you treat it right, it will produce amazing bread for you. Now, if you want us to stop that process, like if you're going on holidays and you don't want to be feeding it every day, you simply just put a normal lid on it and you pop it in the fridge. So you can do that for a period of time. And that's worked quite well. In my case, I have given many batches of this sourdough to many friends, foodie friends in Canberra and elsewhere. In fact, Neil even gave some sourdough to a friend in Melbourne on Friday. He drove it down to his wife in Melbourne. And through my Buy Nothing community. So if anything happens to this, I know I have backups. At least I hope I've got backups. I've got many people to ask. Now to feed it again, unless you're going to cook with this straight away, you actually discard about half of it. So you'd throw out about half of it in the sink and down the drain. Sometimes I use it to make other things like pizza dough. Like I make pizza dough as normal, but add that in and then only put about a third of the yeast that I'd normally use. Some people can sort of make it into a fritter or crumpets or other things, but you do need to get rid of it. Now, at first, being frugal, I didn't want to do that, and so what I'd do is I'd sort of make that quantity and then I'd make double, and I'd make double again, and I'd end up with so much starch that it's sad if you don't have another use for the starter to throw it out. It actually saves a lot in the long run. So you throw about half and then you build it up again. And so you need to keep feeding it every day because the starter's hungry and it needs to have that flour to feed on. If you don't do that, it will sort of turn alcoholic and then you'll kill the starter over time. It'll starve, it won't have enough to eat. So that's how you maintain your starter. Now, for those of you who don't want to go out, who are in isolation right now, and you don't want to see anyone, and you're concerned about, even the touch of things, and this, I should add, is a very valid concern. Even in my Buy Nothing group, we've been having big discussions about whether or not we should keep gifting at this time, and public health is, of course, paramount, and so a lot of people are choosing not to give. And so if you are unable to get a starter from someone or you don't want to go out to get a starter, you can make your own. And I've had friends who've been doing it lately, and one who posted yesterday, Sarah, if you're watching, I've been looking at your sourdough and it looks fantastic. And she's made it entirely from scratch. So all you do is basically what we're doing here now. You start with a bit of flour and a bit of water in equal quantities. Say about, you could start perhaps with a quarter or an eighth of a cup of flour and equal cups of water, and then you leave it sit in a nice warm place, covered for a day, and then you throw half of it out and then you put more flour and more water in equal quantities, and then you throw it out, and you keep doing that for about 7 days. Now that sounds easy, but it's a bit more anxious in a way when you're making it from scratch. I haven't managed to make that happen myself, although I might try one day. But there are a few tips that you can use with that. One is that some people believe that using the leftover water from boiling potatoes is particularly good. It's quite starchy, it's quite nutritious water, and that works quite well in terms of getting that bubbling happening. Some people really like to use a good quality flour, particularly a rye flour or a wholemeal flour, to really help get that sourdough going. So it gets a really nice, strong flavour and develops those kind of characteristics. Whether or not you want to bake with rye or sourdough later is up to you, but at least you get that starter that has that kind of nice flavour and nice characteristics. So that's the starter, and make sure if you haven't already, hit me up with lots of questions about the starter. Like I said, I'm still learning, and I nearly lost my starter in January and February when it was super hot, but I managed to save it with a bit of TLC and love, and thankfully I've given away lots to people. If you're a friend in Canberra and you'd like some, you know, after isolation, hit me up and I'm more than happy to give you some. Now we're actually going to cook with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my Kogan thermo blend, which is kind of like it's a thermo cooker. So I'm just using this because it'll just make it a bit easier than using it by hand. If you have a bread maker or if you have a Thermomix or another thermo cooker, you can use this method. Otherwise, you can just use it by hand. And my Neil has pointed out something really important to me, which is I've forgotten to put this in. It wouldn't cook very well, wouldn't mix very well if it didn't have something. So I'm using this kind of attachment that will make bread. You can also use a food processor that has a bread or mixing attachment, or you could go old-fashioned and you can use your hands, which is kind of lovely. I just find it takes a bit of time, and being a busy mum with writing and other things, time is kind of really important for me right now. Now, ideally, it would have probably been good for me to let that starter ferment a bit longer before I use it, but it'll be okay. If you've taken your starter out from the fridge, feed it and then leave it outside for at least a day before you use it. So don't expect to just take it out in the fridge where it's been chilling out and use it straight away. It'll still be active, but you really want it to be bubbling along nicely, and it won't be. And so basically, this is about how much I'm using. So I'm not quite sure what that equates to. I think it equates to about 1/4 of a cup. It's not that necessarily to be super exact because you vary the amount of the flour that goes in, but that's pretty much it. And to that I add 1/2 teaspoon of salt, a cups of water. There's no special requirement with the water. I think some people like to use filtered water, particularly if they want that all natural experience, but I've been using tap water and it's fine. Canberra tap water is quite nice. If you had really bad tap water, you might want to think differently about it, but I find it's fine. And this is 3.5 cups of flour. Now, ideally, to get that really crusty bread texture that we associate with a sourdough bread, it's really important to use baker's flour, and the reason for that is it has a higher protein content. That said, I recognise that a lot of people are having trouble right now getting any flour at all. And I know I've had a lot of people write to me to express that while I've written articles about baking bread and baking white bread and baking sourdough, they just can't get flour. We're very blessed because we were actually buying baker's flour from Costco as this all started. In retrospect, I wish I'd bought 2, but we didn't hoard then and we don't hoard now. And subsequently, Neil managed to find 10 kilograms of normal plain flour at Costco, which we have, by the way, offered for others in the community if anyone wants it, but so far no one's taken up on our offer. And so I will now, for the rest of isolation, be using normal plain flour. normal plain flour produces a softer result. Like, it's not wrong, it's not going to kill your sourdough or anything like that, but it's just, you make cakes with this because this kind of flour is softer, and it's a softer texture. So it'll be a different kind of texture of sourdough, but you will not starve. It might be what a top bakery will use, but it will be okay. Necessity is a wonderful thing. So I put it all in, put it in my Thermomix. Or this isn't a Thermomix, sorry, just to correct, it is a Kogan type of thermo cooker, and I usually put it on for about 10 minutes. In colder months, I put it on for about 30 degrees, so not really too hotter. Like making normal bread, a lukewarm temperature for adding water is ideal, but I find that 30 degrees works fine. Any hotter than that, it starts to cook at the bottom anyway. And not a huge speed, but if it's too low, I find it sort of doesn't have enough strength to mix it. So I leave that going. Just making sure it's all in, because that'd be embarrassing. And look, here's one that I made before. And this one rose particularly well. So this is going to mix for about 10 minutes and then, or longer. And then once that's mixed in there, you leave that sit for about 12 hours, ideally overnight. At the moment, the weather's fine, but in another couple of weeks, I suspect it won't be fine, in which case we'll need to put it in an esky with a hot water bottle. Or put it somewhere that it's, covered in towels and somewhere warm, because it needs a really warm place to rise. But this one I put in about 8 hours ago. This one was sitting in my bread maker, and it looks lovely. So it's about the right texture. So with this one, we're about good to go. So let me just get a bit of, normally I do a bit of flour, but I forgot and I took it out. So I'm going to use a little bit of semolina, which is what I'm dusting this with. But normally I would use a bit of other flour. Oops. And see what it looks like? So it's actually a lot stickier than a normal conventional bread dough. And you want it to be not too heavy, because you want it to have those really big holes in it, making it a bit like when you make, if you're eating Swiss cheese and you see those big holes that you get in it. It's really, I think, from the gases that are being released. Neil will probably correct me, is it oxygen that it emits, or is it carbon? It's carbon, thank you.
Dioxide.
Carbon dioxide, thank you, that it emits as it's baking. So you want it sort of nice and sticky so it does that. And usually this is Neil's job, and he does a much better job of this than me.
Just don't do it too hard.
He says don't do it too hard, and it's actually more stretching, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm still learning with this. I'm not a professional baker. I'm a home cook, and if I can make sourdough bread, anyone can make sourdough bread. You can see how it's got all those nice bubbles, see that? That fills me with excitement. And you can usually, at this stage, when you take it out, you get a real sense about whether it's going to be a good batch of sourdough or not. We've had some amazing batches in the probably about 6 months that we've been making sourdough. And let me just say, there's nothing more impressive to take to a dinner party, a potluck dinner, Christmas gathering than your own homemade sourdough bread. It's just one of those things that is just going to wow people. And it doesn't cost a lot of money. I think I've costed it about 50 cents a loaf, which is a lot cheaper than a lot of those gourmet ones. And it's super yum. But then we've had some that have flopped. They haven't sort of cooked in the middle, or they sort of just haven't quite worked. So we sort of shape it like there. Now, sometimes we can cook it straight away, but usually we like to put it in a bowl with a little bit of flour. This is just semolina flour, but normally I'd use normal flour, either's fine.
Straight on there.
And I would normally sort of put it in there, and with some Glad wrap over the top or a towel, and allow it to rise. But my Neil is saying let's not bother about that step. But let me just show you what it looks like. So this is just a cloth, a wet cloth, and ideally you'd sit it there for about 30 minutes so it would rise up a little bit, but we may or may not do that point right now. And then when it's ready, you tip it out onto here, and then you do what we did earlier, which was to slash it and then put it in a super hot oven with a steam tray underneath. So let's sit that there for now. And let's just have a look here. This isn't finished yet, this is still going. Still got a little bit longer to go. I just wanted you to see what that texture's like. So it's nice and warm, it's nice and gooey. If you think it's too gooey, you can put some more flour in. I probably will a little bit with this. But it's not as firm as a traditional white bread. You want it to be quite sticky. It's probably a little bit too sticky, but you want it to be quite sticky. So I'm going to let that go and see what happens with that. In the meantime,
It's not pushed down.
now that I've put it in properly. In the meantime, let's just have a sneak peek at our bread. Do you remember the bread that we put on about 20 minutes ago? Let's have a look and see what's happening to it. It's looking pretty good. What do you think, Neil? Ready to take out or a bit longer?
A little bit longer, it's not dark enough.
I am going to put that back for a few minutes. Now you might say, but it's golden brown, Serina, it looks like it's ready. What I've learnt from doing sourdough, from the ones that didn't work and the ones that did work, is that sourdough really works best when it's got that crusty dough on the outside, when it's actually quite dark on the outside, much darker than I would have than say a conventional white loaf. And if you don't bake it that long, sometimes in the middle it's still gooey like a cake dough. You can't really rescue it when you pull it out too early. You can put it back in and you can cook it a bit, but once you've taken it out of the oven, it's it's not really able to be rescued. It's a bit, it's had its day. So you want to make sure that it's cooked enough. So don't rush your sourdough. I find it usually takes a good 25 to 30 minutes in a super hot oven for it to cook. If you're lucky enough to have something like a wood-fired oven, which is super, 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 super hot, well then that's a different story altogether. This type of bread is really ideally suited for those hot temperatures, and it will cook a lot quicker with that. At least that is the idea. So, I'm wondering what we should do now. I think we've explained most things, unless my Neil's got any other ideas about anything else we should talk about. I will post some pictures very soon of the bread when it comes out. It's very close to coming out. I'm tempted to keep talking for another couple of minutes so you can see it. In fact, I might just get my tray so that you can see what it is like, and a knife. Crusty crust. The crust is very thick and strong, and you do need a good quality knife, bread knife, to cut it. I guess you could tear it with your hands if you wanted to, but it wouldn't be quite as good. So a good knife is something that is quite essential when you have sourdough. I remember years ago buying bread from a fancy bakery, and I asked them to have my white loaf sliced, and they were offended and said, "We don't slice bread here, you need to go and buy a bread knife." And I was a student at the time and I didn't have a lot of money, and I was quite appalled and never went back. However, I will say, with all the money you will save from baking your own sourdough bread, once isolation is over, do go out to an op shop and find yourself a bread knife. It'll be really good, or put the call out on your Buy Nothing group and get one. It'll be fantastic. Shall we try the bread?
Yeah, might as well.
We might well. It's not, I'd probably cook it a little bit longer, but it'll be fine.
It's looking better.
It is looking good. It's hollow. The other way you can test if something's done, I used to work as a bakery when I was going through uni. I never thought that I'd end up doing Facebook Live about baking bread. Is you want to see if the bottom's done. If the bottom's not done, you've got a problem. What am I going to do? I want to move this one away. Ooh. So normally we put this on a cooling wire rack and leave it for a little while before we cut it. But let's see if the proof is in the tasting. We ready? Hear that crust. Doesn't that look fantastic? And look at that. It's cooked.
A little bit doughy in the middle.
It's a little bit doughy, is it?
Yeah, just in here.
Just a little bit doughy.
Need a bit
so
longer.
we'll put it in a little bit longer. But you can see there the lovely texture that we've got. I'll cut this bit a little bit further. That lovely crust, that crispy crust that we've got. Most imperfect cutting imaginable. And yes, still a bit doughy. We were impatient because of this Facebook Live. We'll put that back in the oven a little bit. But it smells fantastic, doesn't it, Neil?
Yep.
Yep.
Vegemite and butter.
Well, olive oil and balsamic, but both are good, but I'm very partial to Vegemite. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to see photos of your own sourdough adventures and any tips you have. I'm sure there's a lot of expert bakers in this group who are watching this and are far more expert than me. And any questions you have about sourdough, I'm more than happy to have a stab at answering them. Thank you so much for watching.